Major support for Out to Lunch is provided by the law firm of Jones Walker, established in 1937 with over 375 attorneys in offices throughout the U.S., providing a comprehensive range of services to a local, national, and international client base. JonesWalker.com. And by Hancock Whitney. Hancock Whitney is here for families, here for businesses, here for communities during this challenging time. Visit HancockWhitney.com/COVID-19 for the latest. And by Short & Associates, legal recruiters in Louisiana and Texas.
From our socially distanced virtual lunch table in New Orleans, this is a special edition of Out to Lunch, New Orleans at the Crossroads, hosted by Tulane University Freeman School of Business professor and director of the Birkenroad Reports, Peter Raschuti.
Hi, I'm Peter Raschuti. Welcome to this special edition of Out to Lunch, New Orleans at the Crossroads. We've been at the crossroads before. If we wanted to list every economic boom and bust cycle in New Orleans, we could go back to the very first flood in 1719, when Bienville was still building the first settlements. We survived that one, and we've survived other attempts at devastation. Most recently, after 2005, we did way more than bounce back from Hurricane Katrina. The restoration of the city resulted in a massive economic boom, and for the first time in around 40 years, a net migration gain. In what could only be described as a shocking surprise to those of us living here, New Orleans went from being a place you left if you wanted to start any sort of high-achieving career to a place where smart, young, entrepreneurial people moved to start a business. The city changed markedly. We started discussing issues we'd never had to confront before: gentrification, cost of living increases, prohibitive rents, property tax hikes. Before we knew it, we had more restaurants than we had before the hurricane. A couple of years ago, the city came up with a more accurate way of counting how many tourists were coming here and discovered it's way more than we had thought. The real number of tourists is around 19 million a year. Things, it seemed, couldn't have been going much better for New Orleans. Then one day, in March 2020, all that came to a sudden stop. Apparently, thanks to Mardi Gras a month earlier, New Orleans had unknowingly become a hotspot for the novel coronavirus COVID-19. We went into a mode called lockdown, which was kind of like a voluntary house arrest. At first, it didn't seem too bad, even for businesses who had to temporarily close their doors. But what was going to be a few weeks of semi-vacation where those who could worked from home and those who couldn't collected more money in unemployment insurance than they were making at work has turned into something else. Months later, the 19 million tourists are gone. We don't know how, when, or if they're ever going to come back in the numbers we knew before. Entrepreneurs are struggling to survive. Many small businesses that have managed to reopen are making do with significantly less revenue and are forced to lay off staff. Under occupational restrictions and because of people's continued fear of catching the virus, restaurants are starving for business. Some notable restaurants are already closed for good. Unemployment is at an historic high, and our world-famous live music industry is shut down. So what are we going to do? We can cross our fingers and hope that everything eventually bounces back like it has every other time we've had a disaster for 300 years. Or plan B, we can use an enormous amount of talent and resources that the last dilemma delivered to us on the crest of the migration and economic wave and proactively take action to change the direction of the city so we can cope with and even capitalize on the new reality. And that, Plan B, is what we're doing here today. My guests on this special edition of Out to Lunch are all dealing with the economic impact of the pandemic. Grayson Gill is the owner of Bellegarde Bakery. Until the end of July, when he was forced to close, hopefully temporarily, Bellegarde operated a local retail bakery. It also shipped flour, grits, and pasta nationwide and provided products to more than 120 restaurants. In 2020, Grayson Gill was a finalist for the James Beard Award, the Academy Awards of Food, for Outstanding Baker. Grayson, welcomed Out to Lunch. Eric Cook is a combat veteran who served 6 years in the United States Marine Corps. After his military career, Eric returned to his native New Orleans and became a chef. Eric has cooked at some of New Orleans' finest restaurants, including Commander's Palace, until July of 2020 when it was forced to close, hopefully temporarily. Eric was owner and executive chef at his own restaurant, Gris Gris, in the Lower Garden District. Eric, welcomed Out to Lunch.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
Carol Markowitz is COO and Senior Vice President of Finance at Loyola University. Carol was previously the founding executive director of NOCI, New Orleans Culinary and Hospitality Institute. She worked in corporate finance in Los Angeles and has an MBA from the Harvard Business School. Carol, welcome to Out to Lunch.
Thanks, Peter.
Matt Wisdom is founder and CEO of New Orleans-based TurboSquid. TurboSquid is the Amazon.com of 3D models. It's the world's leading marketplace for the type of 3D models used in everything from movies and video games to commercials and teaching tools. Matt, welcomed Out to Lunch.
Hey, Peter. Thanks for having me.
Holly Devon is a writer, senior editor at Anti-Gravity magazine, and founding editor of The Iron Lattice, a New Orleans quarterly arts publication. Holly has written extensively about tourism and urban planning in New Orleans. Holly, welcomed Out to Lunch.
Thanks so much for having me.
Kristen Palmer is a member of the New Orleans City Council representing District C, which includes Algiers, the French Quarter, the Marigny, Treme, St. Roch, and Bywater neighborhoods. Kristen,
Peter.
welcomed Out to Lunch.
Thank you.
Kristen, you played a very active role in the city's recovery from Hurricane Katrina. You were the executive director of an organization called Rebuilding Together. At one point, you were coordinating 10,000 volunteers. That was before you were on the city council. Is there one thing you learned from your Katrina recovery experience that you wish the city had gotten right? Now that you're part of the city government, you can make it happen. What does the recovering economy need most the city to do?
Well, I think there are some interesting parallels between what happened with Katrina versus now. I was in housing after Katrina, and so I was, like you said, I was involved. But even before Katrina, I was involved in rebuilding houses for low-income, elderly, disabled homeowners all over in neighborhoods all over the city. And when Katrina hit, all of a sudden everybody was having this conversation about housing and about poverty and what that meant to the city. And I think, and what the sense of place means, right? And that really kind of drove the conversation of how we were going to come back and how we're going to rebuild. Fast forward to today, when I came back, I spoke a lot about sustainable tourism and what that means and what that looks like. And one of the negative impacts, right, was the short-term rental and how that really led to increased property values, pushing folks out of a lot of the neighborhoods, especially like, my district, French Quarter, Marigny, Bywater, Treme, St. Roch. And, at that point, you couldn't see the forest through the trees when we were rebuilding. You never thought that there would ever be a lack of housing in a way, right? Because we always were surrounded by all these vacant, blighted housing. Then you look at post-COVID. I think what's happened is almost the same thing with housing and having that conversation as is with the tourism industry and what that means and the gig economy and how vulnerable it is, right? And so I actually think now is more of a time to talk about sustainable tourism and what that looks like moving forward and how we can build a more sustainable model. Because, what I'm seeing in the streets every day, and, we were operating food pantries starting in March and we haven't stopped yet. And the immediacy of the needs 2 weeks after shutdown, where people in the hospitality industry could not afford food and basic needs, and that were coming, and we still haven't really seen a shutoff of that, I think speaks to the vulnerability of our industry. And even the Brookings Institute post-COVID, they have a list of the cities that are going to be the hardest to come back. And New Orleans is in the top 10, and that's specifically linked to our reliance of the tourism industry and hospitality industry, I should say. And so to me, the question is, and I love the hospitality industry. I think like all of us here, I worked my way through college, waiting tables, tending bar, doing all those kinds of things. And I think it's a great industry, but we have to figure out a way and a model of doing it better. And I just think sustainable tourism is part of that.
Holly, I know you've written a lot about tourism. Do you think we can, tough way to put this, but get fewer tourists and better tourists? Less big-ass beers and more people going to the Ogden Museum of Art or something like that?
Definitely. I think that going forward, one of the things that we can focus on is how to make an economy that primarily is for ourselves and each other. And, we love restaurants, we love bars, we love great music. So if we are investing our money and energy into those places, tourists will also want to be a part of that. No one throws a better party than a New Orleanian. We don't need to do much. The city sells itself. I think that part of the problem is we have a lot of structures in place right now in government that is taking a lot of the tourism money and diverting it away from the people that need it the most. So I think there are actually, this is a great opportunity to change some things that have been holding us back for a long time. And if we can start looking at our government structures, particularly our tax structures, I think that there is a lot we can do to just shift the conversation away from who we're attracting specifically in terms of tourism, but how we're managing that income.
New Orleans is a city of 400,000 people, but many of our businesses are built around a customer base of millions of people, and namely the 19 million tourists who come here every year. And now that the tourists have suddenly stopped coming, we're discovering that a number of businesses simply can't keep their doors open without them. The question I want to put to you now is, how workable is that business model? Should we embrace it and try to attract as many tourists to get back here as quickly as possible? Or should we be looking at pitching local businesses at a level that is proportionate with the permanent population? Grayson, where do you come down on this?
That's a tough question in the sense that there's a lot of answers to that. But I think it's critical, and Holly picked up on it briefly, is that what I'm looking for is a structural change and a systemic change. And I feel like, just like Katrina, I wasn't here for Katrina, I moved here in 2009, but I think that COVID's forcing all of us to change in the same way that Katrina did, whether we want to or not. So now is an opportunity to control that change and to be amicable to that change, whether we like it or not, as opposed to resist it or fight it. But I don't think there's going to be Band-Aids or anything, aspirins for the cancer that we can approach any further when it comes to the structural changes that we need to make in the city, whether that's tourism or economy or public health or transportation or criminal justice reform. Like all of these things, I think now is a time to systemically change those things. So when it comes to focusing on a more local audience in terms of a clientele for a business, I think it's critical that we do our best for that and that we approximate that. I don't feel like as a business owner, I was irresponsible in terms of my growth or my overhead. I had a business model that was predicated on wholesale, and the majority of my wholesale customers weren't necessarily themselves predicated on tourism, but just the absolute disruption of the city, and most critically, how, not just as New Orleanians, but how as Americans we eat, where we go to Costco or we go to Sam's Club or we go to Rouse's one day a week. That really denigrates and hurts small people like me, where you don't have a clearinghouse in New Orleans for small local vendors as myself. And it is a city that's very much predicated on the car culture. So it would be great to have a neighborhood cafe in every neighborhood. I live in Miss Palmer's district, and there's plenty of neighborhood cafes that we have there. But it's a great question, Peter, that I don't necessarily have an answer to. Is that I feel like historically and traditionally, the city does have the precedent for the intimacy of commerce between neighbors and between a neighborhood. And I think that, like the rest of America, we lost that because of cars and because of suburbs and because of highways. But there is a lot of precedent in New Orleans with the public market system. So the city still owns the St. Roch Market, which is also in Miss Palmer's district. That's a city-owned building. And for those listeners that don't know, New Orleans up until about World War II had about 30 to 35 public market buildings that were owned by the city, very much like the French market, where local artisans like me or like a butcher or whomever, a vegetable grower, could sell with a pretty fair value rent to businesses or to neighborhoods. And that was populated and pocketed strategically throughout neighborhoods of the city. And I think that's something critical that we need help from the government. I don't want to look to capitalism or private enterprise as being the solution for, I think, these really intimate, ancient needs for commerce and the commerce of food. And I really think the government needs to step in and take not just a role, but I think take the baggage and the weight off of small people like myself and like Eric, for example, to make things like that happen. I don't think that we need to rely on the private market to privatize public needs and public solutions. I think that the public in the form of the local government should be the ones that are stepping up to provide those solutions for people like myself and to a lesser extent Eric. Eric's more of a chef, but in terms of small artisans like me, I think it's critical that the city do what it can and use current resources, like let's say the St. Roch Market, which we own. We own that building, and make it a real market. Make it a place for people to go and eat fresh, healthy, local food, and that's good not just for the economy, but also for ecology in terms of what we're doing to our land and the surrounding farms and everything else.
Matt, I wanted to ask you, you've been really one of the city's most successful entrepreneurs, and we talk about diversifying the economy. One of the problems we really have, whether or not anyone wants to talk about it, is we can get some companies to move here, but it's kind of a tough sell. We're weird. They want, people want kind of a cookie cutter place to go to. And what would we need to do on the entrepreneurial side to make more Matt Wisdoms?
Well, the entrepreneur side, thank you for the lead up there. The entrepreneurial side is, we're growing, we're doing better than we ever were. It's another one of those things. It's another post-Katrina thing. We've been fighting this fight to have people want to start companies here. The number of times I've been in conversations with people trying to come here who are like, hey, what's the school situation? They need public schools they can count on. And literally, if they were like, we could get a school as good as a Lusher or a Franklin or whatever and be guaranteed that, we'd be in a totally different landscape. Like, that is the number one thing, is like a reliable school system that I end up dealing with. But I'd say, like, just in terms of some of the questions you've been asking, I think about this sort of two ways. What we've just had happen to us, separate from the pandemic, is the future just got rushed forward at us about what things are going to look like 5-10 years down the line.
This is Matt Wisdom.
And what you're seeing is that
Turbo Squid.
Wall Street and the rest of this have literally bet trillions of dollars on the vision of machines delivering food to us and running things and automation, Amazon. So I think that there's the near term, that Grayson was talking about. There's the near term and like what our experiences are. But just as a city, the part that's sort of freaking me out, my partner, she just dropped into Whole Foods in Metairie, stopped in. A lot of it's sectioned off for Amazon Prime pickers who are just grabbing stuff as fast as they can and walking out. And there's a dystopian side of this, which is like, right, how are we eating? There is some portion of what's happening very soon is machines are going to be sourcing everything and sending it to us at a cheap cost. And then there's the local artisan social experience that's on the other side, where you go to seek out people, have food that's hand grown, we know why it's there. And that bifurcation has happened at lightning speed. And we've just now seen what it looks like. And it's a bit terrifying. New Orleans is that place where we'll get, like, people want the experience. So like, how do we supply that part that's the human experience here? That's why people love us, and that's the big deal. The entrepreneurial side is people want that, and getting companies. So we have an office space downtown, 13,000 square feet. 0 people want to work there now. Totally empty. Every single month, nobody will go back. We're sitting there. There's a big diffusion from California, from New York. Some of that's getting away from hotspots, but people don't want to pay those rents. So the question is, on balance, Turbo Squid will have some people who now you can work anywhere from, as long as you do your job. Some people move away, some people move here. New Orleans is going to be competing for a great place to live against all these super expensive cities, whether it's San Francisco or other areas. Will we win on balance? Because a lot of people are going to work from home. So there's a reshuffling that's happening that is, it's hard to understand where we are. We're positioned to win on some of that stuff, but there's so many different movements happening that it's opportunity. It's terrifying. There are ways that we can win, but it's going to be disruptive, and a little bit frightening.
Matt, one of the things you mentioned there that really grabbed me was the idea that we're moving in this direction anyway. It just put it on steroids and a faster track.
Can I ask Matt a question?
Yeah.
So Matt, cities like Tulsa and Savannah are really going after and having marketing campaigns going after that model of people can work from home now, they can work anywhere they want. How do we attract them to our city? Because basically you don't have to worry about a startup company, right? They already come with revenue, they already come with a job. And so they are marketing their quality of life as opposed to trying to get a whole business to move. And it seems like it's something that I've been talking about, Peter, you and I've been talking about that on the calls, does New Orleans have a space for that? I mean, I hear you about schools, and you and I, our kids went to the same school, and we appreciate that. But I do think when you talk about millennials and younger folks that don't have children, this is still a very real city with a soul. And we're a walkable city. We have funky businesses. We have a very unique quality of life. And we were losing population as of last year. Is there a space for us to also market our city to people that can work from home?
I think we're going to have to do that, because that's going to be an increasing portion of both the workforce, but also the income, the revenue. Like, the amount of allocation of income is going to go to people who can work from anywhere at an increasing pace. We want them here, and we can do it. And I agree with you. There's that question of, like, once you start hitting the kid situation, and then you start hitting the school situation, and that's a different problem. And we're doing better than we have on the schools and a lot of stuff. But I think that's critical, because we do have that high culture piece and the low cost piece to offer to folks. Like, I think that's gelling a vision around where we are and where we're going to be, I think, is really important. And that's got to be a part of it.
Good, because you see, I think that we're going to lose a lot our restaurants, right? And we talk about how do we flip it so that we can if we have more restaurants per capita, then we can, I know we all love to eat out. I'd love to eat out every single night, but it's not sustainable. And I feel like if we can get folks coming in that can add to it, it would also help.
Just to respond to that, I think one of the things I'm hearing, I understand where you're coming from, but I have some concern when I'm hearing that coming from a sector of the population that is dealing with the high cost of living as it is. And I think we all have to be really conscientious that when you are having people making San Francisco incomes in a city like New Orleans, then that's going to really change the game for a lot of us that are still struggling. So something I've been thinking a lot about is less how do we attract more money, because that is a lot of the model that we're working with right now, and more how do we reshuffle the resources we already have. I think that is really important for us to take a look at the major economic shifts that are going on in the vulnerable populations of New Orleans. So ever since this hit, Kristen mentioned this earlier about food banks, things like that. The mutual aid societies have been doing extraordinary work. People have been getting fed. People are getting free plants, gardening. There are real food resources that are completely underutilized right now that might go great in a place like the St. Roch Market. There is an economic shift that's happening away from just trying to generate more income and really trying to reshuffle the resources, particularly downtown, a lot of these areas. So that's something that's going on in that part of the population. I think that if they were able to flourish without having to deal with the cost of living that we have right now, I think we could see some really exciting changes. But right now, if we look at something like the rent problem, something that I've been really concerned about is nonprofit property tax exemptions. So this is something that New Orleans has a huge problem with, where nonprofits are pretty much given carte blanche for property tax exemptions, and that it doesn't necessarily need to be tied to public good. This could be properties used commercially. So there's, I believe in 2016, the Bureau of Governmental Reporting found that 60% of properties were off the tax roll. So if we look at that, right, if we can lower property taxes, but include more properties as part of the taxable pool, then we're able to take some of the heat off of the cost of living, and we don't necessarily need to market ourselves to other people.
What do you think, Carol? We weren't just talking about schools. Obviously, you could have religious institutions, a bunch of folks, hospitals that any nonprofits that don't pay taxes. But where can the money come from, Carol? One of the things that always concerns me is when you have these conversations, the only other side is raise sales taxes, which is it's a regressionary tax. And where does the money come from, Carol? There's secret pockets we can find?
Well, this might not be a direct answer to that question, but I really want to give voice to something that I've been very passionate about over the last several years, in my involvement with the Culinary Institute, is that I think what this pandemic has really brought to light, as we've talked about so much already, is like our over-reliance on tourism. And as it relates to food, I think that I see a huge, broad food economy as going from plow to plate, right? And there's like
This is Carol
production,
Market,
there's
COO
packaging,
of
there's
Loyola
marketing, there's
University.
distribution. I mean, there's a whole industry with different segments of that. And I would say that we only focus predominantly on the plate side of it, right? For the most part. And I think I just can't help but wonder why, when I see other cities that have invested not even huge amounts of dollars, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, but investing thoughtfully in a strategic plan that then helps inform the development of a comprehensive food policy that matches the actual assets of the region or the city's resources, including its people, and not trying to mismatch plans and policies with the reality of who our community is and what education levels they have and all of those things. I mean, that to me is like, something that I think is insanity that we haven't done yet as a city of New Orleans that claims of the 3 pillars it stands on is music, architecture, and food. There's so much there. And you talk about diversifying your economy. I'm sorry, Matt, but forget about tech for a minute. Forget about medical. Moving upwards in the supply chain of how does that food get on a plate that's being served to you by your minimum wage server who has to rely on tips? How about thinking of the ways that we can diversify, even by expanding what the food economy could do for us here in our own region that can provide better wages, more secure jobs in a way that aligns with who our community is already. They don't need to go to medical school to necessarily be working in production and in Grayson Gill's huge new factory that's supplying flour to the whole world or what have you. These are jobs that our community are attainable to our community with some training, right? And it's just mind-boggling that we put investments in things like this big, very expensive medical center and other things, but we're not looking at what's right under our nose, which is why everyone comes here, which is that thing that we serve on the plate with our New Orleans style service and hospitality. Let's take advantage of how much upside is there if we really think through diversifying even within the food economy. And I think it's no irony that of the 6 of us on the call, that 3 of us are either in or have had some heavy involvement in hospitality and culinary and food. I think that this could be a major opportunity for us if we can get enough support for some very limited dollars and coming up with a big master plan and policy for the city of New Orleans as it relates to true strategic food policy.
And just to interject really quick,
This is Holly Devon.
There isn't a secret pot of money. There's a blatant pot of money, all in the convention center. The convention center is sitting on $200 million in reserves. And, that's something that we could probably all use soon. The convention center, the Ernest Morial Authority, the Louisiana Stadium and Exposition, and New Orleans and Company, New Orleans and Company receives $21.1 million a year. I've been researching this issue for months. I still don't really know what they do. We have the money. We just need to reallocate it.
Can I just say we don't actually have the money? I just want to
go
be
ahead.
really clear. That's the state, and the state allocated a certain way. And this administration, this council, and previous ones have consistently gone to the state to try to retool the heads and beds taxes and have a more equitable distribution. But, the problem is when you go to Baton Rouge, our delegation is the minority, and we're funding the rest of the state. I'm not saying not to go after it. I think we have to. I think it's inequitable. It goes along with the whole concept of not having sustainable tourism. It should be our money because it comes on the backs of us. But the reality is that they consistently take it from us in Baton Rouge, and we're outvoted, right? And I just want to be clear about that, because often we throw around this money and they're like, well, just go get it. You city leaders should go get it. And trust me, I was on a conference call with with culture bears yesterday for 3 hours about this very thing. Like, how do we get money to the people that we market the city from and we take from, and they have issues with affordable housing and food resources and all these things as well. But we have to be very real about where it comes from. And I also just want to make another statement real quick that, and you and I have had conversations before, but if a city loses population and doesn't grow, it dies, just like any business. And if we don't attract people, and if we don't bring in new folks or whatever, or even market to the people that we lost, which would be my high point, right? Market in Atlanta and Houston, we're going to die. Infrastructure of the city at our zenith population was for 623,000 people. When Katrina hit, we had 473,000 people. Today, we have 400,000 people. When we talk about money, we have to realize that we're dealing with an infrastructure for a population of 600,000 people that we don't have, who aren't paying into the tax base. So we are consistently going to be at a loss if we don't increase our population base, because we're paying for this infrastructure for a much larger city.
Absolutely.
You know,
and it's not a simple issue.
I know it sounds weird, and I am like 100% with you. Like, we need to market to get folks that we lost first. I mean, I also think that we have to bring everybody in here, because, the reason we have high cost of living is because we have a shrinking tax base, because we're not putting enough housing on the market. And it doesn't matter if it's just for affordable or market rate, we are not building housing to the degree that we should be building housing, because it's really friggin' hard to do business in this town. And I can go on for that for a while. But I mean, this isn't about housing. But anyway, so I just wanted to interject. I'm sorry.
No, I agree with you. And I think that it's, just to be clear, I know it's a state issue. And for instance, the nonprofit tax exemptions, that's the Louisiana Constitution. So that's,
I'm with you 100%. And I'm
and we have to have this conversation as a state as well. And I think that you made a really good point there. But go on ahead.
Look, the orthopedic surgeons come in. I don't know if they still come, but like, what is the New Orleans and Company, or what are they doing, right? Those folks come, and if you, at least for me, talk to different restaurateurs, they tell you they spend surgeons drop a lot of money in the restaurants. It's good for the city. This is what Peter was saying, I think, was like, who are the tourists? Like, who are people who are coming, who are like buying into our culture and doing that? Like, that's a great convention. In my world, most people don't love conventions. And so this is a question, was that whole business gone? I mean, we wrote that out of all of our budgets. Nobody wants to go anymore. There's Zoom conventions, which is a horror show just unto itself. Like, I don't know what the situation is with the convention center at all. I mean, I don't know that business comes back. I wanted to, for the sake of our city, in terms of the orthopedic surgeons, we want them, we want people to come and enjoy this. But that's another possible casualty, is that you don't have to spend all this money to go and have people, your staff leave and be unproductive in terms of the direct line of work for a week so they can go party in another city. Like, it's not clear that businesses are going to keep doing that.
When people in the media talk about New Orleans, they generally lead off with something like New Orleans is best known for its food and music. But by food, what they really mean is restaurants. Commander's Palace, Emerald's, Bayona, Arno's, Galatoire's, and a host of other restaurants, too numerous to name, because there are over 1,400 of them. On July 24th, Mayor Cantrell put the city into shock when she announced that in order to flatten the curve of the virus infection, she was going to discourage people from hanging out on the street by outlawing drinks to go. One of the immediate unintended consequences of this decision was to hurt restaurants. Restaurants who were struggling to survive were selling meals to go. Along with meals, they were selling drinks to go. Drinks are around 30% of a restaurant's income. For music clubs, that's probably closer to 100%. So when we say we're known for food and music, the truth is that neither our restaurants or our live music industry can survive without alcohol. The answer to this next question might be just a flat no, but while we're rethinking the economy of the city, we have to ask it. The question is, if our goal is a diversified economy, do we need to find a way to sell food and music that doesn't depend on alcohol? Eric, I gotta have you lead off on this.
Well, I want to follow up. When we talked about earlier, they said, what does New Orleans really have? And we mentioned that it was music, architecture, and food. What I've always said, since I'm born and raised in New Orleans, and I've watched the city change over my life, and I'm 50 years old, and I've seen a lot of changes go on. I was here during Katrina. Obviously, I stayed in town. you know, it's made all these different changes along the way. But you watch the companies leave. You watch, you know, we used to be the most powerful port in the nation, you know, and that's the first thing my mind always goes to is what happened to our port, you know? And for me, New Orleans, I've always telling people that we're food, music, and booze. And that's pretty much it, because we've lost our Fortune 500s. We've lost the oil business. Our port, to me, you know, I don't see a growth in the port. I see, you know, we're switching it to be some kind of Disneyland cruise ship terminal. And I think we're losing what we talked about earlier with the effort to bring that plow to plate type situation to New Orleans for what we really represent as a city. Yeah, we've got this great 300-year-old culture. We've got the French Quarter, but the French Quarter doesn't get half of the attention it should get, because, you know, 40% of it that people visit is just filthy and dirty and bars, and that's it, you know. And our riverfront, yeah, we work, it's changed, we try and beautify and do some things, but I always think like our amazing natural resources that we have here in South Louisiana should funnel right through the city of New Orleans. And unfortunately for us as restaurant owners, we can't buy a lot of our own seafood. You know, you can't buy redfish for a restaurant in New Orleans in Louisiana. And people don't really know that. Like anything you see in a restaurant in Louisiana or in New Orleans that they call redfish is not coming from Louisiana, because we're not allowed to, because there's restrictions on us. We have to buy from Texas. We have to buy from the Carolinas. We have to buy from anywhere else but Louisiana, because those restrictions are on restaurants because of whatever moratoriums, or, you know, we've lost our coastline. You know, if you look at the Gulf states, I've had conversations with Lieutenant Governor and members of the Wildlife and Fisheries Department about what happened to our coastline. 5 Gulf states have 21 miles of state coast. Louisiana has 10 or 11 miles. We've lost 10 miles of our own coast for other states to come into and take our natural resources to distribute and go away. No one manages resources better than Louisiana. There's 4 ports of entry you can come in Louisiana to manage seafood. 4. You look at a state like Florida, there's probably, you know, 2,700. We control what comes in and out of our waters, but unfortunately more people come into our waters and take it away. We look at redfish, we look at shrimp, we look at crabs, things like that, just to name seafood, and it goes away. I think, you know, you talk about, you know, restaurants and the conversation people immediately go to when they think about New Orleans is, oh, it's such a great food town. But that great food town is the hardest town in the world to do food in. To operate a business and restaurants in New Orleans is the hardest thing in the world. Besides not having access to your own resources, or the prices being elevated through the roof, when literally, you know, I'm in Algiers, you know, and you know, I'm a 20-minute drive from throwing a line in the water and catching redfish and trout, and you know, I can pick up fresh shrimp off the side of the road. But in a restaurant, you know, that little bit of distance from where that shrimp comes from to where it hits the distributor to where it goes to the restaurant, you're talking about sometimes a 500-600% markup, you know, that goes from what those fishermen spend to catch all that fish and that shrimp on fuel and just their own, that's their livelihood, their homes, their family, their education. To get that product into market goes to a distributor, then goes to restaurants. And it's insane what we pay for that kind of stuff. You know, so we're hammering ourselves on our own natural resources, which really doesn't make any sense to me, you know. And we talk about taxation. We mentioned it's a hard place to do business in New Orleans. It is. I would love to see the Port of New Orleans come back. Why, you know, one of my favorite things to do when I leave New Orleans and travel, you know, I usually go down to Florida. There's a place in Pensacola called Joe Patty's, and it's an amazing seafood market where boats actually back up to it. And you can walk in this huge space, a giant seafood market you can walk into, and fresh seafood is everywhere. Where can you find seafood like that in New Orleans, anywhere that's not a grocery store chain? Why is there not a seafood market? You know, New Orleans is built on that river. Steamboats coming up, dropping off oysters, you know, bringing in fresh seafood, delivering right to the docks of our city. Where has that gone? That's been manipulated and taken away. And it's become taking away from the people who actually work on those boats and in those fields, who bring us our amazing, the rice, the shrimp, the fish, the oysters, the crab. Where'd that go? It's going to other places. It's going to Chesapeake Bay, which they can't manage their waters. Their bay is dead, so they take all our crabs. And we can't buy crab meat for less than $40 a pound sometimes. $40 a pound to buy crab meat. Think about that, $40 a pound for crab meat. When I used to run some big restaurants down in the city, you're talking about spending $10,000, $15,000 a day to have crab meat.
Eric, I love that you brought up the port, because to build on what you're saying, it's not just about what we already produce here in our backyard. But I just told this while we were talking, and the data is kind of outdated. But as of 10 years ago, okay, so just to give us an order of magnitude, it says 40% of the U.S.'s agricultural exports moved through our port. And you talk about the value add part of the food chain, where we can maybe build more of our economy around that, even if we inserted ourselves there and not even all the way back to the plow or the fishing, so to speak, in the fishing nets. But even if we inserted ourselves in some level of the processing, the packaging, any of that before all the stuff moves through our port. I mean, that's insane to think of how many of our country's goods are moving through our port here. Like, why are we not looking at that as an opportunity to grow the pie here? I mean, of course, we should always be looking at how do we get more out of taxes and how to manage all that and optimize that. But I'm just thinking, like, how can we think about how business plays a role in expanding that pie and expanding the economy that moves beyond attracting people here where the money's coming from somewhere else, but actually generating that money here. I think there's tremendous opportunity if we're talking about just the few resources we've talked about on this call so far. And I love that you brought up the port. That's a huge asset.
It's huge. I mean, that's why this entire city was founded, because of its location, the mouth of the Mississippi River. Everything comes through our port. Everything does, you know. And we talk about restaurants and what we can do in sustainability. You know, when this whole thing began in March, and I think we were one of the first restaurants to close, you know, I told everyone, I said, it's going to be a 10-month summer. You know what I mean? Because once you lose spring, get into summer, traditionally, since I've been working, you know, in the early 90s, you know, in the French Quarter, when I worked at Brennan's in the French Quarter, you know, you knew in summertime, that was it. It was over. You know, the industry stopped, restaurants stopped, it just went away. That's why you have things like Culinary Restaurant Week, because we know we plan as a business owner to lose money in the summer every summer. And when this happened, you know, I said, hey, it's going to be catastrophic, because I know I lose money every summer. I know big giant restaurants budget to lose hundreds of thousands of dollars every summer. And that's something we got to work on. Why don't we have, you know, we cannot sustain our own, you know, industry as restaurants in New Orleans. You have to lose money. We're 100%. Now, I'm not going to say 100%. I'm going to say, you know, we're very dependent on tourism, for restaurants, because we need that, because we don't have that sustainable business model for a full year. We don't. We know it's summertime. A lot of folks leave New Orleans in the summer. They get out. They go to their second homes in Florida. They travel. The kids are out. There's vacation. It's hot. It's hurricane season. The convention center doesn't book anything because people don't want to put deposits down on large conventions and possibly lose that money or reschedule because of a storm, which we're having a very active season. You know, we have to look inside. We talked about having all these restaurants. I remember, I think before Katrina, we were around 500-600 restaurants, somewhere around there in the neighborhood. After Katrina, 10 years later, we're 1,500, you know, and that's insane to me. But what's happening is you see, you know, as a young cook, when I was, you know, worked at the big restaurants, I always said, oh, we need the small restaurants. We need the small restaurants. So, you know, you're in that juvenile phase of cooking, like you want to do all the hot, fun, trendy stuff. But we had the big restaurants, you know, the Antoines, the Commanders, you know, the Brennans, the Galatoirs. They kind of ran the show. But now if you see the restaurant trend that's going in New Orleans, you know, I'm a restaurant owner, you know, and I'm look like some guy, you know, off the beach, you know, but that's the trend. People are opening up smaller businesses in smaller neighborhoods, more bistro, more cafe.
What do you think about the whole street scene of turning New Orleans into like restaurants with on-street dining?
Matt
Like I saw that
from Turbo Squid.
Fantastic. The French Quarter being an open pedestrian mall, that kind of stuff. I love that.
Yeah, I love that idea. But we have to go back to, like, you know, when I worked in the Quarter, and I worked there for, you know, 14 years, the hardest part about working in the Quarter is getting in and out of the Quarter. You know, we already have no parking. There's no parking garages. We don't want to build garages in those parking lots and block our view of the river, I guess. I don't know what it is, but to change it to a pedestrian mall and not allow vehicles in, now you're asking the thousands and thousands of hotel and restaurant and bar workers to park in an area that is traditionally not as safe as could be to park closer into where the action's going on. What do? You know, so you have to build outside, you know. And again, you know, when we were offered the opportunity to move outside, it's a way to generate income for the city as well too. You pay a lot of money to have tables outside. Trust me. You pay for the air above your balcony. You pay for your own, the sidewalk that the city owns. You carry the city as an insuree on your insurance because they own it, but you maintain it. There's got to be a change in that. You know, we talked about taxation. You know, people, you know, think that the misconception of restaurant owners is that we're just swimming in piles of money because we're making all kind of money. And I'm telling you right now, if you're a really, 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 really good operator, you might stay with anywhere from 7 to 10 cents on a dollar. You know what I mean? And that's if you're great. The average is somewhere between 3 and 5 cents on a dollar, because the amount of taxation, the amount of money you spend, the labor, the insurance, the spaces, the rent, you know, everything that goes on. I mean, you're talking 3 to 5 cents on a dollar. And, you know, and the people who are moving into these smaller restaurants are doing it because they can manage those small numbers. And we're trying to get that neighborhood place going. But without tourism, New Orleans is built on tourism. I think we need to bring people here for a different reason. You know, the Super Bowl, you know, is one of our biggest money generating events because people know New Orleans knows how to throw a party. Because we do. We've got that food. We've got that culture. We've got that walking city where you can walk from hotel to restaurant to venue. You know, and we need to bring that back. You know, the open space in the French Quarter would be amazing, but we have to protect the folks who are going there. We have to, you know, allow the folks who live in the quarter full time to keep that area of the French Quarter theirs, because it's an amazing place that 90% of the people who live in New Orleans have never seen behind one of those walls of what their French Quarter, how beautiful it really is. And we need to protect that. We need to protect our, you know, our history and our culture. But I think the port's the way to go.
Well,
I mean,
to go back to the port, the reason that we lost the port is because the Board of Commissioners in 1984 consciously shifted away from a shipping economy to a tourism economy. And that was how the convention center economy really started with the, the World's Fair. So yeah. I think that that's really important to look at, because there are a lot of behind the scenes decisions that are happening a long time ago. And we think of ourselves as having this identity of a tourism city. It's pretty recent, and it's not necessarily an identity we chose for ourselves.
And Grayson, you're a big part of this food equation. What do you think?
I've got quite a few points I want to bring up, but and I'm not calling anyone out. And I think a critical lesson in my life has been something that Martin Luther King Jr. said, that we're never trying to defeat people, we're trying to defeat policies. So just want to preface everything with that. But I've been running what I would assume is a sustainable food business in New Orleans for 8 years, and I've never seen a dime from the city, the state, or the federal government to help out with anything that I've done. Sourcing organic food, sourcing local ingredients. I've never gotten a nickel from anybody. So that's a huge issue. On my end, I also think something that Carol was mentioning and that all of us have been talking around is that I think that you can make the argument, which I'm not going to do now, that COVID's been an indictment of the American diet, because our vulnerable populations that are suffering most from COVID are suffering more than anything from a terrible diet, terrible food. So I'm one that really, you know, is a proponent of public health and preventative care. So as Carol said, I would like to just maybe tear down the new hospitals that are built and just build urban farms and prenatal facilities and playgrounds and all of those things, because I think preventative health is something that's much more, it's not as lucrative financially, but emotionally and ethically and socially, it's much more profitable for us as a city and as a community. And I think also something that we're all talking around but agreeing with for the most part is that in order to make New Orleans more attractive to other people, I think we need to address the people that live in New Orleans now and make New Orleans more attractive to the people that live here now. And that's going to make New Orleans attractive to people that want to come back or want to come here. But if we pander to these people that Holly said have a huge salary, I'm not denigrating that aspect of our economy. I'm just saying we need to focus on who we are as a city and the people that define and have defined New Orleans as a city for 300 years, as opposed to hoping for somebody else, you know, however big or however small that demographic is. But if we don't make New Orleans more livable, for New Orleanians, and I think it's a moot point to want to attract other people from Savannah or Tulsa or wherever else they want to come from. And then going off of what Eric said, I just think that it's critical that, and also what Carol said, is that we have resources. We don't need to reinvent ourselves or do anything different. We just need to promote and foster, and I think cultivate the resources that we have, whether that's cultural or whether that's ecological, whether that's food, whether that's seafood, whether that's jazz, whether that's students that go to NOCA, whether that's poets and writers and painters that live in the Treme. This is our culture, and I feel like the cultural economy has been appropriated from people that make that economy. And as Holly has been alluding to, and I totally understand what Ms. Palmer is saying, that we don't have control over those tax funds, but I feel, and I'm not trying to be insensitive, but it's very much a plantation economy where the people that generate the culture, the people that make New Orleans what it is now and have been doing for hundreds of years, are still being, we're still being exploited and taken away from, whether that's going to Baton Rouge or whether it's Cisco or US Foods or these companies that just use us as a mattress to extract and take away and not invest locally. But as we all know, we live in a society where we can be accountable to ourselves, and politically we can be accountable and have our leaders be accountable for us. And I think it's critical that we start doing that. But at the end of the day, it's about that systemic structural change. And I don't feel like we can have, good public health policies without help from the state, local, or federal government. We can't have a seafood market like Eric was talking about unless the state or the local government is going to help and incentive. I, as a sustainable or an organic business or whatever you want to call me, I can't compete financially with Cisco, with Restaurant Depot, with Monsanto, with Syngenta, with US Foods, or with Aramark, because I'm the small person. But I don't think people come to New Orleans to eat at those places or have those experiences at restaurants that serve that kind of food. You don't go to New Orleans and say, gee, I had a great meal at Bubba Gump Shrimp Company. And I'm not denigrating Bubba Gump, but I had a great meal and a great experience. I had a great meal and a great experience at Cafe Dauphine. I had an incredible time at Kermit's Mother-in-Law Lounge. I had a great meal at Bacchanal. This is the fabric, not just economically of New Orleans, but emotionally. And I just feel like we're completely being neglected. And we have for a long time, but thankfully, I think COVID is presenting us with this huge opportunity for us to address socially, and I think most critically structurally, the changes that we have to make. And it's apparent that the changes that we have to make, they're visible because we see them all around us. I was honestly almost disgusted to get a 811 or a 311 text message from the governor, from the mayor, about citizens contributing to rent relief to help people from stop getting evicted from their homes, like last week. Because again, I know that the state has the final control over an eviction court. I'm not going to get into that, right now, but the fact that I feel like the local, to a lesser extent, and the state government is asking local citizens to do what the government is meant and supposed to be doing. And not just as a citizen, but as a business owner, is overwhelming and it's unacceptable.
Another vital part of the New Orleans economy is music, and tourism professionals, economic pundits, and politicians talk about the importance of what they call the cultural economy. But there's a disconnect here, despite the fact that we pride ourselves on being the birthplace of jazz, and music plays a central part in our lives, from brass bands to jazz fest. Most musicians are not getting rich. Now that the future of live music hangs in the balance along with everything else, we could use this opportunity to take music and musicians seriously while we're considering how tourism, restaurants, and small businesses come back from the downturn. Do we just assume that music is a star system and some people are going to make it and others aren't? Or is there a way we can proactively improve the lives and the livelihoods of the people we're proud to claim as central to our culture? Matt, would you like to weigh in on this?
Well, I mean, I'm a third-rate guitarist and enjoy playing music and love it. And, would trade the empire for a journeyman position in a band. But some of this comes back to, I think, one of the ways that this discussion is hinging, which is there is an idea of wealth and resources that's running through a lot of these conversations. And I would argue that New Orleans is, in fact, a culturally rich, economically poor city. We do not have the resources that we need. We are far from it. We cannot afford our drainage. We cannot fix the roads. So we pay hundreds of millions of dollars in destruction to our cars because we can't have basic roads. Like if you see what real wealth looks like in other places, it is staggering, and it is a different thing than what we have. So there is a very small pie. And I agree that the convention center is holding a lot of money. It's not sure, like that's one of the only pies we've got. But so we're really sort of stuck in this place. And like, how do we build up the city for itself? I mean, one of the things I think the state banned us from is raising the minimum wage. I don't know what the restaurant owners would think about that stuff, but we need there to be more just basic income in the city to
The
enjoy.
LRA will fight that.
So the what?
The industry will fight.
The industry won't like that, but that's one of those questions.
I'm sure. I'm not just saying it's also, you can say government this, government that, but a lot of it's also industry driven too, and the lobbyists in Baton Rouge, and it's like this vicious cycle. I mean, Matt, I totally agree with you. But when you look at the hospitality industry, the median income is $20,000 a year, right? And people don't realize that. In the rest of America, the AMI is $53,000. In New Orleans, it's $36,000 in New Orleans. So we are an incredibly poor city. And I think we have to recognize that on top of, all of our, and Matt, I'm glad you brought all of our infrastructure needs, everything is a constant drain. And we do need a structural shift. I mean, I absolutely agree with that. And I absolutely agree with what Grayson is saying, that, you got to focus on the people first. I mean, in Charleston, I loved the mayor there for many, many years, said every decision he makes is first for the resident. And then everything else follows. Then you get tourism, then businesses want to move there, then all these other things happen. And I totally agree with that. And I do think you've seen a shift, especially with transportation, other things of what we're doing, the complete streets work that I did initially. We're seeing a seismic shift in how we're redoing and retooling our city. But because we are so poor, right, we're going to always be, we're behind the thing. It just means that I think just what you're saying, Peter, is we have to look for creative, innovative things. When you talk about the port and your lack of resources for fish and farming and the things that Carol's talking about as well, I think we should be looking at phase 3 for the convention center. I mean, right there, why would we want to turn that into a tourism-based economy right there on the river when we could have something like a huge market with the boats coming in off there that would actually wind up not just being an attraction, but servicing all the restaurants and all the other businesses there too. I mean, that's how we should be looking at how we retool this,
Just to look at the musician question, this is definitely the world that I move in.
This is writer and publisher,
for all of us,
Holly
we
Devon.
can't pay our rent. So if you want to do one thing to preserve the musicians in New Orleans, the rent is not sustainable. And I have been talking around it a little bit. When we talk about cost of living, we are living in a state of suspension. All of the costs are as if the economy is as it was, and it isn't. And, as was mentioned earlier, we don't know if convention tourism is coming back. I think it would be great to use that space in a different way. I think we have so many possibilities. There's so much we can do to redistribute a lot of the wealth that we have. But first things first, people are going to start getting evicted. And the second that federal funding gets cut, we are going to live in a hellscape. It's not a joke, and it is immediate. And musicians are struggling enormously. There's people don't really want to pay tips for a Zoom performance anymore. It's over. So, I understand that it's complex and that you can't just pay lower rent. I'm saying that the property tax issue, the reason I'm passionate about it is when I sit down and I look at the system, you cannot convince a landlord to lower rents until their costs have lowered as well. And, I know a lot of people that are very angry at landlords and, kind of just want to cancel rent. And I know it's not nearly as simple as that. I've spoken a lot to Andrea Nika Morris, who does amazing work with housing in New Orleans. And, she has a tremendous amount of vision, but no one's listening and no one's really absorbing the fact that we can't keep living in the pre-COVID reality.
Well, how much is Airbnb impacting the rent situation? I'm very curious, Kristen. I think you've been in the middle of that.
Yeah, I have been. And that's why I came back, right? It was because of what the STR issue decimated all the neighborhoods in my district. And quite frankly, within a very short amount of time. So Holly, when you look at the STR issue, within about 5 years, they took 6,000 to 8,000 units off the market. So if you think about it in those terms, that STRs actually took units and then put them into that vein, and this is all, why I got back in this game, because it was just abhorrent losing this, and that really, in certain neighborhoods, it absolutely increased to the cost of rent, and not in all neighborhoods, but in that. And then I also think on top of that is we're not building enough units, not just in affordable, but even market rate, et cetera. Like the more units, and business people know this, the more units that you put out, and you can start correcting it. We have, it's tough to do business. I build houses, I renovate houses. It's very tough to do business in this town. But in addition to that, even in trying to go after subsidies for affordable housing, like low-income tax credits, you have to go to the state. The state's totally reevaluated how they give out affordable housing dollars. And now all of the benefits go towards rural communities as opposed to urban. So all the money that we had post-Katrina that was going to affordable housing, a lot of that now has been rediverted towards rural. And I'm also going to say too, it's about time to start really focusing on all these vacant and blighted houses and pushing them back into commerce. And we have to be unapologetic about that. It's been 15 years past Katrina. And what we're doing is, by not getting them back into commerce, we're actually exacerbating the affordable housing crisis. And look, and Andronika and I go way back, and we were talking about this last few days ago, and we both are trying to find policies that we can get these properties back into commerce, because if we don't, then it's, again, it just like you said, it hurts our tax base. We can't get more people coming in here, and we can't get, more importantly, affordable housing. And which is another reason why I've been focused so much on transportation, because we've been consequently pushing folks to like New Orleans East and parts of Algiers, where we have less transportation options than we did post-K, right? Which is why I'm like fanatical about complete streets and ferries and buses. Because if we don't connect people to jobs, where have you, it just exacerbates the whole problem,
One of the things I know we've been kind of focusing on this broader topic of how we can reinvent ourselves, kind of in light of the pandemic.
This is Carol
I also
Markowitz,
want to say that
COO
I've been
of
encouraged
Loyola
about the other thing
University.
that's been happening in our world is this dialogue that's been happening around race and equity. And I think one of the things I'm hopeful for is that conversation really takes root and continues here in a meaningful way, because I find that, like, I've lived here for 10 years, and while I can say, okay, on like technical terms, it's a diverse city in the sense that 60% of our community, I believe, is African American. The fact is, there's a huge difference, I think we all recognize, between being diverse and being a place where it's truly equitable. And when you see the socioeconomic lines so clearly driven along the paralleling those the racial divide, if you will, in our city, I think it's just telling that we have to address that if we're going to preserve what's special about us and maintain that authenticity that basically makes all of us love the place that we live, but also brings those people to visit New Orleans. And if we don't really look at that more mindfully about how we preserve that in a responsible way by creating more equity, I think a lot of the conversation we've been having is really about that. And I think we haven't brought up the word race, but I'll just say that conversation, I think we need to be more open and explicit about the changes we need to make specifically around making it more racially equitable. If we're talking about reinventing New Orleans, I think that's probably the most important thing, in my opinion.
Well, it goes back to what Grayson was saying about a plantation economy.
Yes.
There's an unbroken line of controlling Black labor in Louisiana since its founding. And I think it's really important that we understand the way those paradigms transform and shift. When I say that the board of commissioners of the port transitioned to a tourism economy in the 80s, there's a conscious decision to sell Black service labor in that. And not only to sell that labor, but to sell the culture that they created out of that hardship. And it's particularly egregious to commodify that when you consider that that's an act of resistance. Jazz is resistance, and jazz is historical memory. And we have to respect that memory and change the way that we do business, recognizing that so much of global prosperity is predicated on the plantation system. And it's hard. A lot of the work I do, I work with the Whitney Plantation, and I'm a historical interpreter. And, it's something that I like to bring into conversations as much as possible. But it's hard because we don't really have a precedent for working history into our daily lived realities. We talk about things in the abstract. Economics is something that I'm frustrated with economics as a field oftentimes because it takes place in a vacuum, and how we understand the tensions that created New Orleans, created Louisiana, and how they have continued to inform the way that we live our lives is hugely important. And we can get into mass incarceration. I mean, I've lived in the Ninth Ward since I moved to New Orleans, and it's been a brutal education in the way the city works and who is listened to, and a lot of my neighbors who grew up in a lot of times the Desire Projects or the Florida would go to work in the service industry. And I would see this too. I worked in the service industry. I've been paying my rent through that, as long as I've lived in New Orleans as well. And the racism I see in those kitchens and the way that people will hire formerly incarcerated people as a way to hold it over their heads and treat them abysmally, it'll chill your blood.
The COVID-19 pandemic has pushed both the global economy and the U.S. economy into uncharted waters. Now, here in New Orleans, after a few years of buoyant growth, we're back in a position that is relatively familiar, recovering from a disaster. We've done this before. As significant as the city's current financial downturn is, and it is significant, we know we're not going to be destroyed by it. We're all determined that we're not going to lose our restaurants. We're not going to lose our musicians. We're not going to lose our small businesses. We're going to find a way to coexist with tourists at whatever numbers they return in. But none of this is going to happen if we just cross our fingers and hope for the best. Looking back, it's easy to say New Orleans bounced back from Hurricane Katrina. But that bounce back was the result of a huge amount of hard work, dedication, and determination to save the city by every single New Orleanian. This recovery is going to be no different. Thankfully, we don't have the physical devastation to deal with, but we do have an economy to rebuild. It's going to take everybody's contribution in one way or another to keep the city the great American treasure that it is. Maybe you're a musician or a small business owner who's dedicated to staying here and staying in business. Or you're a citizen who makes a point to buy local, to support a local restaurant, to go online and buy a t-shirt from a local musician's website. Each in our own small way, we can all do something to help New Orleans get our thriving economy back. And we all have a voice to talk about it, to share our troubles, and to encourage each other with ideas and concrete plans for getting to the other side of this unforeseen pandemic-induced economic downturn. Thank you to everybody in New Orleans who is hanging in there, and today special thanks to my guests for hanging in here for the past 60 minutes. Council member Kristen Palmer, Chef Eric Cook, owner of Grigri Restaurant, Holly Devon, senior editor at Anti-Gravity Magazine and founding editor of The Iron Lattice, Matt Wisdom, founder and CEO of Turbo Squid, Carol Markowitz, COO and senior vice president of finance at Loyola University, and Grayson Gill, owner of Bellegarde Bakery. Kristen, Eric, Holly, Matt, Carol, and Grayson, thank you all so much for joining me today on this special edition of Out to Lunch, New Orleans at the Crossroads. We edited this show to fit into our time slot here at WWNO. You can hear a longer version of this, our entire unedited conversation, by listening to the Out to Lunch podcast. You can find and subscribe to the Out to Lunch podcast anywhere you get podcasts and on our website, itsneworleans.com. If you want to know what we look like, you can find photos from this show on itsneworleans.com and on our Out to Lunch social media. These photos were taken today by Jill LaFleur. You can find more of Jill's photos at lafleurphoto.com. Out to Lunch is a production of INO Broadcasting for itsneworleans.com and WWNO 89.9 FM. The producer of our show is Grant Morris, our technical producer is Eric Merle, and our researcher is Maggie Mendel. I'm Peter Raschuti. Thanks for joining me for this special edition of Out to Lunch, New Orleans at the Crossroads. I look forward to meeting you again next week around the lunch table for more business, New Orleans style, on Out to Lunch.
Major support for Out to Lunch is provided by the law firm of Jones Walker, established in 1937 with over 375 attorneys in offices throughout the U.S., providing a comprehensive range of services to a local, national, and international client base. JonesWalker.com. And by Hancock Whitney. Hancock Whitney is here for families, here for businesses, here for communities during this challenging time. Visit HancockWhitney.com/COVID-19 for the latest. And by Short & Associates, legal recruiters in Louisiana and Texas. Mitchell Foreman wrote and performs all the music on Out to Lunch. You can hear Mitchell's music anywhere great jazz is sold or streamed, and at mitchellforeman.com.